Thanks for having us. So as Margaret said, we're going to have sort of a discussion a little bit back and forth, and it's kind of a good opportunity that we wanted to set it up this way because Sid and I have been on opposite sides of the table, but we're also good friends, and so we will hold a couple punches, I'm sure. But one of the things that I wanted to talk about, something that I've been doing impact investing for a long time now, and I've also been an entrepreneur and still am an entrepreneur. I have a startup, which is an investment fund. So as I like to say, it's just a startup that we have to raise a whole lot more money for. But one of the things that we notice, and one of the more critical junctures that we see in investing, and there's a lot of things, and Sid and I want to kind of have a conversation and talk back, or I'm going to interview Sid a bit and get his perspective on being on that side of the table about the process and some of the ways that we make decisions and we sort of pivot to the market, because there's a big adjustment that every social entrepreneur in particular, every entrepreneur is going to have to go through this. But it's even more important because you guys are sitting here, and a lot of social entrepreneurs are sitting in the United States, or sitting in Western Europe, or sitting in developed Asia, and you're sitting at elite university programs, and you might even be sitting behind the desk at a Dahlberg or McKinsey or somewhere where you're making a nice paycheck, and now you're looking and you're saying, I want to go solve the problem of these people, and I know this problem really well because I wrote a report on it and because I've been on the ground for 6 months, and that's great, but you're not someone who actually needs an improved cook stove or who needs a mobile application to find a job, because you probably are sitting in front of a brand new MacBook or something like that. And so there is this detachment or this mismatch, a lot of ways, of what we call need and demand confusion. And need is a projected value. It's what I say that you need in order to fulfill my preconceived notions of your life, quality of life, or in some cases, your health. Demand is something that you're telling me, so it's the other way. It's the signal coming from you, and I'm just responding to it. So I'm meeting that demand. And this is like something that, as an entrepreneur, and trust me, like I said, I've done this and I've made the same mistakes. It becomes that first bit. As you get into starting the business, you're mapping it out, you're planning out this business, and you're saying, these people need this product, and I'm going to write the perfect business model, and they're going to adopt it. And they're going to adopt it in droves because they need this project. And then you get out there, and the first bit of information comes from the market, and you say, holy crap, what's going on? Why don't they respond? Why aren't they just lining up to buy this? And you find that the demand might be a different case. And so I wanted to start the topic off tonight, and we're going to be pretty open. The other thing I was going to say, raise your hand at any moment. This is intended to be a dialogue, and you're supposed to kind of tax us and come and test us and get more information for throughout the conversation. You don't have to save it to the end, so we will kind of stop and answer questions along the way. But to start us off, I wanted to ask Sid, when you came into this and you sat there and you guys were mapping this out, and also I'd like to say, as an introduction, I told you I run an investment fund called Invested Development. We focus in seed stage companies, largely in mobile and alternative energy, as well as the agriculture, ag tech sector that we're just launching off. And we have 12 companies across 8 countries and 3 continents. So we do kind of spread it out, and we're very early seed stage. And Sid will introduce you a little bit to his background and what he did, in particular with insured labor. And then I'd like you to jump in and tell us, when you started mapping out insured labor, what was that need that you guys perceived, and how did that change when you found out what the demand really was?
Sure. Thanks, Miguel. So as Miguel said, and as Margot introduced, I have a background in mobile and IT infrastructure. And that's kind of how I came into assured labor, which I'll talk about a little bit shortly. My current role is CTO of TinyURL, which is anything but a social enterprise. So I can speak to sort of how we've tackled, how I've tackled different ventures throughout my life. And we'll talk about that in a little bit as far as raising money versus not raising money and those sort of issues. But to get to Miguel's question about mapping out assured labor, I really came into assured labor kind of in the early stages, not at the very beginning. I was working with a bunch of Sloan students who had conceived of the idea in their second year at Sloan.
Can you give us a little bit of an idea of what the idea was and what
Sure.
assured labor?
And so assured labor basically was the general concept in its beginning was to develop a marketplace where people in emerging markets in the informal labor sector could easily find work using cell phones as the primary means of communication. So imagine if you are a business that actually this is a specific use case that my team went through when they did some research. There was a business down in Brazil that needed people to distribute phone books. And what they found was that the people that they hired to distribute phone books, half the phone books would never make it to their intended destination. So the idea was that this business could send a simple text message out to a huge swath of people, have those people come in, and then throughout the process of hiring and doing jobs, people would rate each other on trustworthiness and other characteristics, and you'd build a sort of circle of trust between employers and workers. So that was the general concept of assured labor and how it really started, and that's where our sort of focus was when we started the company, was really focusing on the informal labor sector, where people, just standing on streets, picking up work to do ad hoc, and that's the whole company was really founded around that premise, and we did a lot of our work initially around that premise. It pivoted over time, and we can get into details on that. But as far as mapping out the need, the real work to figure out that initial idea was based on some research that my partners did when they went down to Brazil. So they took at least 1 or 2 trips down to Brazil, where our initial market was going to be. That ended up not being the case. And they found that people had this desire to find trustworthy people in the informal labor sector, and how would you do that? And so that was kind of our initial thesis. The initial sort of idea was, we're going to bring effectively a huge swath of workers in the informal labor sector kind of into the light, into a more formal ecosystem where they could get jobs.
And what was the first kind of clue that you thought, okay, maybe this isn't going to work the way we thought it would?
I think the first clue was when we first tried to actually do a pilot here in Boston, is we started getting a lot of questions from investors and also from users. Is when you think informal labor, a lot of it is people like house cleaners, people like plumbers, people who are working around your house. And so one of the first questions was, well, why should I trust random guy off the street? How are you going to bootstrap this whole thing? How are you going to get that initial trust factor built into the system? I'm not going to just hire someone who has no references, no background check. Where is that all coming from? And so that was our first kind of sort of hint as to, this is sort of a little more challenging problem than just signing up a bunch of people and sending a text message.
So it was the actual informal market that you wanted to formalize was the problem in itself, in that the fact that these people were not in a formal system and could not be verified, that actually created hesitance from the consumer to adopt it.
I think that was a theory, and I'm not sure that we actually tested that specific theory properly. And I just sort of taking a step back just from that specific point is, when you start a venture, you have a bunch of theories about how things are going to work. And what we found is that oftentimes as an entrepreneur, there's a tendency to project your own theories onto your market segments, saying, oh, yeah, you definitely need that, because I know you need that. And I've seen it, in 1 or 2 cases, and because of that, you tend to run with it. But yeah, the idea was there was this perceived notion that if we bring a bunch of people into the formal sector will get people signing up for the service because we'll have an inherent trust. I think the digital aspect of it was kind of almost our initial idea that, because of that digital aspect, there's got to be some sort of trust factor because they have to sign up some way rather than just, being on the street.
Like Adobe saying that if you can put the paper on the computer screen, no one actually needs to print it, right?
Exactly.
We all kind of realized later on. So what point is it when you mentioned investors came in and started to advise it? Was that at the beginning part something that was a conflict up front, or did you guys feel like the investors were coming in and telling you information, you were adopting to it, or was it something that you thought initially was, our idea's right, we just need to get out there and prove it?
So our initial push was, we thought our idea was right, we just need to make it happen. And if we have enough money, enough bootstrapping money, we can really make this happen. It wasn't necessarily the right approach in the sense we didn't say, hey, maybe they have a legitimate question here. I mean, from an investor's standpoint, the big challenge was, you guys need critical mass. How are you gonna get distribution through this product? I mean, how are you gonna sign up 10,000 people who live in an informal labor force? Are you going to go around, street corner to street corner? What are you?
So you're saying the investor was right?
Yeah. I mean,
this is being recorded, isn't it? So let's advance. Let's go forward a couple. Let's go forward a couple months. You guys, how did you end up bootstrapping? And you bootstrap, I think, in a way that's actually pretty common right now, and I'm sure something that a lot of, especially the people that are entrepreneurs in the room, are looking at is, you guys went into business plan competitions, right?
Yeah. We actually were in the 100K, and a lot of the genesis of the idea came through that. And not just the 100K, we went through a ton of competitions, the MIT Ideas competition and countless others that I can't remember. But that was a good way to raise some funds. The other thing we did was, which was probably a mistake in hindsight, was trying to launch a pilot here in the U.S. to simulate the conditions that we would experience abroad. In hindsight, it was probably better. I'm a big believer that you need to be where your market is, especially having gone through that experience now. So in hindsight, I think there's an importance to be where your customer or where your user is, so you can understand what they're saying, what they're experiencing, how they're using the product, what they find valuable with your product. Because I think a lot of times, again, this is the whole need versus demand tension, is you perceive a need, but on the other side, that need might be there, but that might be need number 10 on their list of all their things that they consider important.
And with the limited resources, they're only going to get through 8 of those, so you're going to get left out. And I think there's a lot of examples. I think one example that I always use, that I'm going to have to stop using pretty soon because the tides are turning, but is cook stoves, where for years and years they've been trying to sell cook stoves because the need is tremendous. They're internal cooking over open fires. It's just one of the worst things that occurs in large scale in emerging markets. And clean cook stoves can solve that problem, but people don't demand them. Most of the time they become a flower pot outside the hut, and that's about it, and they just don't get used because they were given away, and there's a lot of strategies around it. And that's, if anybody's looking for a case study on sort of need-demand confusion, cook stoves is a great one. Latrines is another one. Public bathrooms is another one where you'll also see it, that tremendous need, but the demand is often harder. In your case, this is a lot harder to interpret, right? Because there's not as many people doing it. There's very few people really trying to go and say, we can organize the labor market digitally. We can do this via text messages. So let's move forward. And I would say, actually, one other thing about you launching here. When I first saw Assured Labor, I was introduced to Assured Labor as a company that was doing this in the U.S. So almost an Angie list via SMS. And I was kind of like, oh, that's interesting, but it's Angie's List via SMS. Then when I meet the guys, and they've already gone through some business plan competitions, and they're now in Nicaragua, and I say, oh, okay, wait a second. Now this is a little bit more interesting. And there's a couple factors that when you look at it that make it a lot more interesting in Nicaragua than they do in the U.S. In part, competition, I think, is it. The other one is that the use case has a very different demand, or let's say use, in emerging markets, simply because of the lack of computers. So if you can kind of go up into that one and say you guys decide to make the move, you make the jump out to Nicaragua. Why and what happened, and how did that change the business?
Yeah, so I mean, that was an interesting sort of inflection point. I think it was our very first inflection point in the company, and inflection meaning pivot. People talk about pivots as kind of this aha moment where all of a sudden, one day you realize, oh man, I'm wrong. I need to go to this. That's not the way pivots work. It's typically kind of this long, drawn-out process where you realize after a month or two or however long worth of data that you can collect, you realize maybe I'm going down the wrong path and maybe I need to try something else. So it's not kind of a clean sort of transition like a basketball pivot. It doesn't work that way.
I kind of equate it to getting into like a really cold lake. At first you just kind of get the toes in, you get the nays, and you're suffering. And by the time you're like waist high or something, you're like, screw this, and you just jump in.
Yeah.
So it looks like it happens all of a sudden, but really it's been this slow process that's led up to usually quite painful process because you've just been butting your head against the wall for a while. Yeah,
and I think that's what we were finding. So just to give you guys timeline, this was, I think, June 2008-ish is when my co-founders graduated from Sloan. And when we kind of all went full time on this venture, so we spent from June 2008 till about December 2008, January 2009, working on the U.S. portion of this venture. It's not until we got approached by who became our partner in Nicaragua. He was looking for a service for his. He had a national chain of internet cafes across Nicaragua that he was looking to add some more value-added services, one of them being jobs. And so he came up to the MIT Media Lab to meet with some folks, and we had good connections in the Media Lab. And through that, we got connected. So we started exploring this Nicaragua opportunity roughly around October, November. And when we finally realized and when we heard enough from investors like, yeah, your U.S. idea sounds great, but it sounds a little bit too much of a Me Too type idea. There was a lot of like, well, what's Angie's List doing? The TaskRabbits, it seems like there's not enough competitive advantage that you guys have here, and the economics of your business here as far as acquiring users versus what you can charge are not compelling enough to make it a fundable business here. Hearing all of that and not getting the traction that we wanted to, that's when we decided to, and we had this relationship in place with this guy saying, hey, come down to Nicaragua. There's, cell phone usage is high down there. There's one carrier, so integration's easy. And it's a small country, so you can easily control the variables. And that's kind of what pushed us towards Nicaragua. I mean, I think it's a sort of general piece of advice I give to entrepreneurs is when you're starting your venture, what your venture really should be is a bunch of tests. And maybe you can speak a little more about what you look for when you look at that guy who comes in the very first time. What is it about them that says, hey, this guy he's going along the right track? Because the investment is also not one of those things that having gone through the process, that generally happens in 1 to 2 meetings. It's kind of a relationship that you build.
Yeah, and that's actually kind of an interesting point when we talk about the pivot is that, and this is something that that I wanted to get your perspective on too, because you're talking a lot about investors, and one of the things that we always worry about as investors, and we're looking at, and you want to look at the entrepreneur and say, okay, this is a person who's headstrong and going to drive through, as we say, kind of run through walls, but at the same time we'll take and absorb advice because there's a lot of people around you who've probably done something similar, and investors, if anything else, we're sort of a house of information because we gather information from so many different points congruently, and that we can absorb those learnings a little bit faster and then share them with somebody else. And so that's kind of a big part of it that we do it. But at the same time, there's the flip side of that, is that we are just as likely, or possibly even more likely, to miss the target market, or misinterpret the target market, or misinterpret some of the demand, or response to demand that happens on the ground, simply because we're sitting in Boston, or in the case where we have an office in Nairobi, and you say, oh, we have an infield office, and that's right, we do, but when we're investing in someone doing ag tech stuff in Nairobi, our guy's not farming. So, we do sometimes have this misplacement. And so when you were starting to look at that pivot, how much of that decision is based on outside forces, and who are you listening to? Are you listening to the customers and they're telling you have to pivot this way? Are you listening to the investors because they're saying you have to pivot that way? Are you guys just listening to yourselves as the team? What leads that discussion, and how does it go?
So I think it's a combination of factors. And I'm glad this part's recorded. I would say don't listen to your investors, the investors that you're talking to, because this is the part where your investors might have good advice, but each investor that you talk to will probably have different advice for you. So you're going to get 500 different pieces of information. What you should listen to is the questions that they're asking and try to figure out if there's a common theme in those questions. Is it something about the customers? Is it something about acquiring customers, distribution? What is it? There should be a common theme that you start to see in those questions that the investors ask.
Yeah, and I think if there's anything that you take away from today, take away that. I think that's actually one of the key things, is that every investor is going to have a million questions, and the best thing is to just look for those patterns and take those patterns, for what they are, and try to find that up in your team. I'd say one of the greatest things, and also the biggest turnoffs, and investing is a lot like dating, so those analogies will always crop up. But a lot of people say like marriage too, right? Once you make the investment. But one of the best things, recently I had this conversation, and I was talking with this entrepreneur, and she's got this great business model, and it's not a great business model, great technology, and it's a very, very kind of interesting, very compelling and story, but I was very turned off by the business model in large part because there was not sort of some focus that we needed, kind of missing some of the key blocking and tackling points that we look for. I was giving her very, very constructive but pretty harsh feedback, and then she just turns to me and she goes, "So what should I do?" And I thought right there, you should probably just leave because it's over. Like, I cannot help you at that point. She'd have to come back, because the second that I feel when we're going into something and that I'm going to affect that pivot at that stage, it's one thing when you're on a board and you're intimately involved with all the company's decisions and you've been sitting there for 3, 6, 9 months, a year, and you're very involved. At that point, yes, I feel like as a board member, interjecting and being a little bit more forceful, that is our job, and that's something that we should do. But at the stage where I'm about to give you money and I'm just learning, and I've read your business plan and I've heard all the stuff that you've told me, and then you turn around and say, "What should I do?" That's like the worst thing you can say. I really felt at that stage that if I gave her any advice, I would jeopardize her company and feel ultimately responsible for it, right? So that's I think a great point that you're making as far as pivot. It has to be yours. You have to own that.
Yeah. You can't ask the investor what they, the investor knows certain things based on businesses they've seen in the past, but they haven't. If your business is anything good, it's not something that they've seen now, because there's something unique about your business, or hopefully there is. If there isn't, then you should go back to the drawing table. But the idea is that you take those questions and then you take them out into the field and say, I am the one who knows how to answer those questions the best, and these are the methods that I'm going to use to answer those questions. So these are the important questions. So, the investor is going to ask you like 10,000 questions. You get the finance questions, you get the unit economics, you get the distribution, you get the product. It's up to you to kind of distill those into 3 to 5 important questions that really matter. And once you do that, you have to go and answer them. And then you have to also convince the investor that, hey, those are the important questions that matter for my business, and this is why. You have to drive that conversation. Sure, the investor is going to ask those questions, and that's what they're here to do. But they're not here to sort of tell you that this is the best way to run your business. Some might think that. And some definitely, through that process, some definitely said, no, you guys should be doing this. You guys should be doing that. But you have to take that with a grain of salt because they come from a different perspective. So ultimately, yes, you do know your business best. But those questions that you're getting are help. You should use them as kind of a guiding star to really focus your efforts.
And as impact entrepreneur, and you kind of had the benefit of looking at both sides, and this is something that I see is that, and I'd love to kind of get your opinion on as well, is that in Silicon Valley or out on 128, you're dealing with investors that a lot of times actually have done this. I mean, they've come out of companies not exactly like your company, but something similar. They've been in the same space, and they get scooped up into the VC funds after they've exited a company for the VC successfully. And so you're sitting across somebody who understands where you are better than almost anyone else, and I think that's a great part of the investment landscape when you're investing in clean tech in Boston or e-commerce or in Silicon Valley. But there's a problem when we get into the impact investment space or social entrepreneurship space, is that you're sitting across someone who maybe did development work or maybe worked in microfinance or maybe is just a high net worth individual, made the money in construction. And now they're offering you advice on a business in Nicaragua or in Latin America in general. So how does that affect it? And do you feel like that's a detriment to that relationship?
So I think this is kind of unique to social enterprises, is because typically social enterprises are focused abroad, and because the world is a big place, your investor typically hasn't seen everything that's out there. So while they might have seen a market in India, for instance, market in India is not the same as a market in Brazil. We learned that pretty quickly as far as when we did our work. So I think there is a little bit of a tendency to sort of kind of chase the rabbit down the hole, with the rabbit being the investor. Especially, you're trying to get that investment so that you can launch your business. And you can sort of say, oh, they're asking these questions, so let me just go and go down that path. But you have to take a step back, and you really have to think about it in terms of, defining the key metrics that will make your business work. So defining those metrics is kind of a hard thing to do, and you shouldn't spend a lot of time sitting behind an Excel spreadsheet and figuring that stuff out. You should be spending more time in front of your customers and figuring out what works for them and what's important to them. Because, again, this goes back to that need-demand tension is if you're not in front of your customer, you may perceive a need, and you may have built your entire model on that need, but that may be the wrong need to address. And you can address a different need, maybe with the same product with some tweaks, and that's where it gets a little sort of it gets tricky with the relationship with as you're talking to investors as you're going through this process. But if you keep the larger picture in mind of what do I need to do to make this business work, meaning how do I get users, how do I get people to use my product? There's a lot of part of the work that I do is with lean startup stuff. I've run lean startup challenge competitions here in Boston for a couple years now, and one of the sort of key aspects of that is to always hypothesize and iterate and test that hypothesis, and one of the key tenets is get people using your product first before you think about how you're going to get them, how you're going to extract value from them, and I think a lot of entrepreneurs don't think that way sometimes. Again, they you develop this great theoretical model around your business, and all of a sudden everything falls apart because one assumption is wrong. And so what you want to do is really sort of flesh out those assumptions as quickly as possible.
Please, go ahead.
Yeah.
So did you follow the rabbit hole, or did you feel that you struck a balance with the company? You said that part of the reason you chose Nicaragua is because there was an opportunity to work with somebody in the internet
Yeah.
business, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Was that a significant opportunity for him as well as you, or did you feel it was a good balance in the correct market for you, Paul?
So this guy that we were working with was not an investor type. He was just a business owner. He was a business owner, and he turned out to be the right partner. Now, if we had listened to investors, there's no way we would have gone to Nicaragua. I mean,
Never let him go. Nicaragua was a really small market, so we'd kind of be like, "Oh, why you waste your time there? Go to Mexico," which would have crushed you guys.
Yeah.
So we would have been wrong.
Yeah, yeah. So I think that's, it's an important lesson, is that go to the place where you can learn the most about your business in the shortest amount of time. And if you can show that you're learning about your business, meaning making progress, and hey, I got 1,000 to 5,000 users in 2 weeks all of a sudden, and you can understand why you got that, and you can understand how you can apply that model from 5,000 to 50,000 to 500,000 users, then that matters to the investor. They might not see it in the beginning. So there, and again, it's a little tough because, especially as a social entrepreneur, a lot of people don't, if you're a first timer, where do I have the money to do all this stuff from?
It's called the soft push off. So we just push off, let you go to Nicaragua, and we watch from a distance. And then if things work, we go, "Hey, come here. Remember, we're friends." But the truth is, though, in a lot of cases, though, I would say this, is that the soft push-up is as much for the entrepreneur's benefit as for the investor's benefit. I mean, we're all responsible for someone's money, so you're watching the money. But on our part, but the other part is too, is that I think that when you're exploring your models, you don't necessarily want the heavy hand of an investor, a third party coming in there and sort of getting your head. And also the other one is, do you think that you benefited from that lean process, from those early days where you had to go rely on customers, as opposed to sitting back and saying, well, we got a ton of cash, let's sit back and develop this perfect thing so that when we go to market, it's absolutely perfect?
Yeah, I think there's actually there's a lot of benefit to being forced to be scrappy, figuring out what works and what doesn't in short amounts of time and with as little resources as possible. Sometimes, it costs money to do some of this stuff, so you're going to need the money from somewhere. So I think when you begin, you really want to try to be as iterative as possible. And when you get an investor on board, sort of a bigger investor, I'm not talking like friends and family money is actually pretty good to do this with, is to iterate. But when you get an investor on board who's giving you $1 million, $2 million, then it's kind of more like, all right, I want you to stop learning and I want you to start making me some money. And so it's more about knowing kind of your model. And sure, that doesn't mean that you're not going to make mistakes once you get a bigger name investor on board. But at the same time, you want to know how to correct those mistakes as quickly as possible by the time you get an investor on board, so that you can say, hey, we did this and we're turning around and not doing this anymore because we saw these key metrics, something fell flat on its face. So let's move on to something else.
There's a great company in our portfolio, a great kind of story about a company in our portfolio called Promethean Power, and I can talk about it because there was an Inc. Article kind of about the same thing. So this cat is definitely out of the bag. But Promethean Power was a MIT startup as well. They also were in the 100K competition and did pretty well. But this was at a different time in the market, and they were in a different sector of the market. So they were a clean tech company with solar panels doing chilling for fruits and vegetables with solar panels. And anybody who knows alternative energy space knows that is sort of a holy grail type thing. because the cooling in general actually requires a tremendous amount of power density, which solar panels do not provide. So if you can figure that out, you've done well. So a bunch of money, a good amount of money poured into them from a very, very high net worth individual, a guy named David Goyal, who a lot of people now say is struggling because what he did was put so much money into such very, very young companies that his returns have not been so great, and a lot of his investment criteria is being criticized. And you never know with investors because sometimes it's just a really long cycle, and he could become the greatest investor in all history in 10 years from now. And so, judgment on these things usually has to be reserved. But this was a company that he put a lot of money in, and these guys went and ran with that money. And so they went to the market, and instead of going there and listening and saying, okay, they decided that the highest and best case for their technology was to go to India and chill milk. It actually is a great market for them, and things are starting to go well. But the first year and a half, 2 years, we blew through a lot of money trying to sell solar-powered milk chillers. And milk collection centers in India are a lot of times a really small little hut with a tin roof. And they're in a little village, and there's kind of a crappy little road to them, and then they're surrounded by agriculture land. It's not too surprising. I think that's how a lot of people would think of dairy farms in India. And in this little hut, they were trying to slap on about like 50 grand worth of solar panels on the roof, and put this chiller in there that took up the whole room. And you kind of look back and you said, how could these guys? They're brilliant. Serene Gamma and his team are probably some of the best engineers that I've ever met in this space. And Serene in particular is a brilliant dude. He's got a great mind. He understands this stuff better than almost anyone I know. And you say, how, you want to shake him sometimes. How do you? So this is a guy who fell in love with this technology. He fell in love with the idea of what he was doing. And it was hard to let go. And the hardest part about it was he didn't have to, because dumb investors, me included, had pumped money into this guy and allowed him to sort of live this mistake for a prolonged period of time. Eventually, the market catches up to you. Eventually, the investment capital runs out, and further investment capital is not going to come bail you out because you don't have traction in market. Your customers have not gripped your technology. They haven't grabbed your product, and they're not running with it. You don't have that tipping point of all of a sudden investors going, oh, well, this thing's about to take off, and if I don't jump on now, I'm going to miss this train. And that's what you need to get that next round of $2 million type investors. And so they didn't hit that point because of that, because they weren't actually forced to look at this. So they did pivot, right? And they pivoted in a pretty significant way. Solar panels are gone, the systems are grid tied, and what they provide is when there's irregular energy, when there's irregular power. You can essentially, in 4 hours of power a day, you can charge a system that will run 24 hours a day. It's very, very, very useful. And I just sat down, actually this past weekend, I just sat down with the second largest dairy managing director of the second largest dairy in the world. And it's in India. It's the largest in India by far. And I talked to him, and this guy's like, oh yeah, it's a no-brainer. I mean, this technology, it's the greatest thing on earth. It has no solar panels anywhere near it. He doesn't care. He doesn't want them. He doesn't need them. In the end, to do what they needed was this technology that would improve the efficacy or extend the grid power, right? So that was an example, I thought, of a pivot that came from social entrepreneurs. I mean, this is Indian farmer market, agriculture market, who didn't pivot early on, and partly because they got too much money, and the investors allowed them not pivot.
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, I think it's very common once you have the money in place. I'm going to just follow this model. Go ahead.
I really liked your story. I participated usually as a mentor or a judge for the 3-day startups here at Harvard, the one they just recently had at MIT. And one of the first things they do, one of the days, is to step away from your computer and actually talk to the people. First of all, do the research to find out if there's like tremendous competition. That brainstorm, think of competition, but then go out and actually try to get somebody to actually, like an actual live person, to sign up to say that they'll use it, whether it's a professor or use school, whatever it is. And then they get the feedback right away, so that you wouldn't have to waste that time of pushing something. So it's trying to teach the future entrepreneurs, like, gee, we need to do this work up front, because they have a tendency to fall in love with the technology and their idea, and not say, like, but what's the cost of customer acquisition, or is there a market for it?
Yeah,
that's the kind of retraining them. So that's why it's a 3-day startup. Not an open.
and I think it's a good point, because we as entrepreneurs do have a tendency to fall in love with our own stuff, and you start to believe your own hype. And it's probably the worst thing you can do. The best thing you can do for yourself is always, come up with a theory and say, yeah, I think this is the best idea ever. You shouldn't. It's not about not being confident about the idea. You should be confident about your idea being working, is going to work. But you have to take a step back and say, okay, will this work, and how do I test out that it's working? If you can do that and show that it's working, or you can show that it doesn't work, but you stumble upon something else, then you're going to make rapid progress through your enterprise. Then you're going to start seeing the leaps and bounds. You're going to start seeing the 1,000 to 10,000 to 100,000 users. Because otherwise what you'll see is, you'll see traction, and you'll see, maybe 100 signups a week, 100 signups a week, 100 signups a week, and you'll be like, okay, yeah, this is great. It's not bad, but it's not going anywhere. What you're looking for is we all joke about the hockey stick. When you create your financial projections, everybody creates a hockey stick. Exponential growth, year 5, you're all billionaires. You've made the investor gazillion dollars. And you create that. But in order to actually get that hockey stick, there's a lot of middling growth in the beginning. It's it's a very tough process. And the quicker that you can get out of that sort of rut by testing different hypotheses out, the faster that you can get to that exponential part. Because otherwise you'll just kind of go, you might grow a little bit, but you're not going to grow enough for a business to really be sustainable, and then definitely not fundable either.
How many of you in here are entrepreneurs, have a business, or starting a business and looking at this? A good handful. And how far along are you?
So I was pitching an idea at Boston Startup Weekend last November. We won the competition, and we've developed our product now to the point where we're in talks with investors that believe in our idea but are now more interested in how we want to incorporate. So now I'm beyond the idea part, having to really learn about the differences between a C Corp versus a benefits corporation, because we're a social enterprise. So it's now kind of, instead of focusing on kind of the sexy kind of ideas part of it, really rolling up the sleeves and trying to understand the operations and introducing them.
Get a good lawyer. I honestly, I'd say the one thing you ever spend money on is get a good lawyer early and fork over. I can, and even from my own perspective, I did my own legal work, setting up the fund and doing all this kind of stuff because it was bootstrapping, and when I finally got a lawyer and they told me I could maybe go to jail for what I did, I was like, okay, well, let's fix this real quick. So sometimes you just want to get that done well ahead of time. It's well worth paying for. And the other one is that investors are guys with money, and guys with money have lawyers. So make sure you have one too. I have a lawyer. We use him religiously, and if I can get an upper hand, and it can save me trouble down the road when there is a disagreement or there is something, then I'm going to do it as well. So you always have to make sure that you're going into battle. Get a lawyer. It's a reason that lawyers last recessions.
And also, lawyers, a lot of lawyers, at least in this town, won't take money up front for upfront. They'll do contingencies. Upon funding, upon something, upon some event. So you can get a lawyer. He'll do your paperwork. He'll take care of all the mumbo jumbo. Because one of the best things you can do, another temptation is to try to do everything yourself, because you feel like for some reason that you need to, payroll, all that stupid stuff. The more that you can outsource, that's not core to your business, but you need to keep running your business. Paychecks if you can afford people, legal stuff, paying the bills, that type of stuff. The more of that stuff that you can keep out of your sort of field of vision, but at least just kind of know what's going on, the better it is, and the more you can focus on your actual business. Because what you should be focusing on, if you have a product, you should be focusing on who are your users 1 through 10. If you don't know who your users 1 through 10 are, and those users 1 through 10 can't translate into users 100 to 1,000, then you're not going to get anywhere.
Yeah, use Backops. Check it out, backops.co. It's just a company that does all your operations in the back end. You pay per month per staff. It's actually really affordable. And I don't own a share in that company. I just use it. So, but has anyone here as an entrepreneur made a pivot or had to pivot? So, chime in.
Developing for the last sort of year and a half, nights and weekends, we've been coding out a social event aggregator, kind of like Twitter, but just for events. Came out of my frustrations at college that so many events that either happen on the same day or not at all. So we developed sort of social calendars, and we put out 2 calendars, 3 weeks ago, up at Colby College. We said, all right, here's the interface. We got a couple hundred users on, and we realized that people don't care what's happening a month out. Calendar, a month calendar is probably the way to go. It's the most basic, but students said, I care what's happening this weekend, maybe 3 or 4 days, but why would I care what's happening 3 days out in my social realm? So we thought, duh, of course. So we didn't really close down. We stopped. We're still sort of maintaining some height, but we're going back to the code and trying to redesign the whole interface. Basically, letting students design the interface. I held a student design competition. Say, what would you want? You have the model here. What would you want to see in this interface? And they voted and then designed went out, and we're going to build that. So we totally pivoted on the whole interface.
When you make that for parents with kids and businesses, then they want it 2 months out. It's like 1 month's not even enough. That's interesting. And did you do surveys or how did you get the feedback from them so quickly?
Well, I went up to the college and just talked to people, sat in a room with them, had a few beers, and drew a million designs, and then posted, to Facebook a couple surveys based on the designs that people actually drew out.
Yeah, that's an excellent thing. I mean, that's the one great thing about being, especially on the internet side, on e-commerce or internet or mobile, is that you can get feedback like that, and your customer base tends to be very vocal too. So it's the best thing that you can do if you can get it. I think it's harder when you're in a B2B play because you have a longer sales cycle. You can't jeopardize relationships by constantly querying them. You don't always want to let them know that there's, hey, we're not 100% sure. This isn't exactly, the grade A. It's like when you're building, the airplane fuselage. You don't want to be like, we haven't really tried this one out yet, but Boeing, come along and let's buy this. It's cheaper. So, there's certain times in certain business you can't do it. But when you're consumer facing, and especially when you're digital, when it's a digital technology, the ability to query your customers and come back and pivot really, really quickly, that sort of rapid prototyping that's part of the lean startup is really important.
And I think for the B2B type businesses, the way you can sort of gather that same information, because it's still important to gather that information as to what's going on with your customer base, is put in the hooks into your product or service that will push information to you on whether people are using your service. So if it's page views, whatever it is, whatever model that you have for your business, if it's some critical workflow that you need your business to go through in order to get to them paying you money or them contacting, extracting value out of your product, make sure you track that through their life cycle. So that way you're not querying them, as Miguel said, because it is tough in the sense that, if you go to a business and you start asking 10,000 questions, they're going to ask you, well, is this really legitimate? And actually, that kind of brings up another thought, was when we were in emerging markets, and this is a challenge in emerging markets, in the U.S., people are tolerant of startups, but in emerging markets, people are not so tolerant of the idea of startup. The idea of startup means immature, you could be gone tomorrow. Why the heck should I use you? So there's that it's a very tricky thing when if you have a company that's dealing with consumers. Again, I think it would work fine to sort of test out multiple things, even in emerging markets.
Depends on the product and service. If it's something that they consider vital or very important to their
yeah.
existence, then it's like we could.
But with businesses, if you're in an emerging market and you try to test out a bunch of things and you're constantly asking questions, you're likely to have the business run away from you. So you have to kind of make it more of a passive way of gathering data. But the key is to gather data, is to present yourself with a hypothesis of, this is the workflow that's important, and this is how I'm going to get paid by my customer, for instance. Make sure they're going through that workflow.
It's something I want to make sure that we cover before we wrap up is you guys did pivot, and you pivoted in a considerable way, and to the point, in a lot of ways you pivoted from being a completely consumer-facing company to being a company that has a B2B play, and is largely B2B play. And how did that come about? How did that change? And I think more importantly, how do you feel about the mission that you guys took into this, and then what you ended up doing? And did you do that because you felt that was the only way to make the company survive? I mean, or was that something that you guys were pushed into?
So I think I'll go over the pivot first to give you guys context. So we went from kind of informal economy where, person A just hires a bunch of housekeepers, or even a construction company where it's kind of hiring people on the road. We went from that to a more formal labor market where it's Walmart, or it's a bank hiring cashiers or tellers or field service agents. It was a completely different, labor market. And I think part of it was there was too much uncertainty around taking a labor pool that was fundamentally informal. They're mobile. How do you keep track of them? How do you get your product out there? How do you do distribution? Because that's a key part of I think in social enterprises, it's actually pretty important, is distribution. How are you going to distribute your product in a cost-effective manner? And so we went from that and sort of getting questions around that and realizing, this distribution problem's kind of hard. And this trust issue is actually also pretty hard without a bunch of partnerships in place. And so that's how we sort of, and then at the same time, we'd be talking to employers and they'd be like, yeah, we are constantly looking for people in our entry-level positions, and we can never find enough people who are what they say they are. A lot of times people come in with resumes, they all look the same. How are you going to find the person who's actually doing what they say they've done? In emerging markets with entry-level positions, this is a very typical thing. And so that's kind of where we focused our efforts, is on that specific problem, and that's where the value was, is when you start, and you can only understand that if you're in front of your customer, and our customer in this case was the Walmarts, the banks, big institutions that don't have tolerance for experimentation, even though there was experimentation going on in the background. It's really about that whole process of going from the individual to the business. Sort of was the result of keeping our ears open as to what people found valuable in the service.
And being on the ground. I mean, you would have never found that marketplace had you guys been looking from here. The data did not stress that as a pain point in that market. It wasn't until you guys were there, right?
Yeah. And I think as far as social mission goes, I think the social mission was the same, meaning getting people who don't have access to good jobs, getting those people to get jobs still. So there was still that underlying sort of impact portion of the business. But I think this is actually a little bit of a challenge with the social enterprise, is the double bottom line or the triple bottom line, whatever you want to call it, is a lot of times you try to balance the two, when what you should really be doing is saying, what's my core mission, and then how do I create a sustainable business on top of that? And sometimes like the details will change. In this case, the detail was we're not dealing with informal labor, we're dealing with a more formalized labor sector. But the idea is still getting people jobs who don't really have good access to jobs. If you can boil down your social mission to that, and that should come really early, you really need to focus on the sustainability part, because if you try to balance the two or you ping pong between the two, you'll spin your wheels a lot.
I think it's actually a great point, and something that we look at in investment is when we're going to invest, we know a lot of times startups can't measure metrics to the point of if you do this service, how much are you going to improve infant mortality rates or this and that by providing better prenatal. A lot of the stuff is actually really hard to quantify. One of the things we look at is we do a lot of lighting and energy kind of investments, and so lighting, one of the impacts is that kids get better educated because they can study at night when the sun goes down. And that's great, but are we going to wait 18 years until they go, oh, yeah, look, high school graduation rates are up for people who use our product. We've actually had an impact. We can't really base it on that. And it's also very hard for companies to track it. And so we kind of go back and do exactly what Sid's saying, which is try to boil it down to its essence. Like, what is the core service that this company is going to do? What is that core benefit? And is that benefit good enough for us? I mean, do we, as impact investors, as social, we have responsibility to our limited partners to go back and explain what we did with the money and how it improved the world. So if we do that, can we boil it down to something that we see value? And with our investments, all but one, which is currently serving the backup camera of the Mercedes-Benz. Other than that, every one of our investments we can go back and justify. Some people pivot in the wrong direction. That was one of them. But we can kind of get into that in another discussion. But I think what time are we supposed to be wrapping up? Is it at 8? 7:30ish? So we're kind of running over time already. What I was going to say, if there's any questions, please ask questions. Kind of open floor. And I understand if some people got to go, we're out of time. Can you stay a couple minutes?
I can
Let's grab a couple questions for anybody who has them, please.
So what type of how do you act for the social ventures look for exits? What type of exits for these?
We actually had that mapped out as one of the questions we didn't get to. That's a great question. So exits are sort of the elephant in the room, and if you're looking at impact investing, it's one of the key areas. And if you're in mission oriented startup or social enterprise, that's one of the big areas that if you're going to take equity investments, if you're going to take capital into equity, you've got to figure a way to get that money back, because investors, and I probably shouldn't have to tell all you guys this, but investors aren't drawing a salary from the business, so the only way to get their money back from equity is either to wait a really, really, really long time for dividends to pay them back, or for most likely there to be some kind of liquidation event, which is what they call colloquially an exit. Most liquidity events come from someone either buying the company or from the company issuing stocks publicly, doing a public offering. Now, the problem with both of those is that in a public offering, now you become publicly shareholders. The shareholder changes, and the shareholders can actually just nix everything. Your whole fiduciary responsibility as a manager of that company and as the board of that company becomes to increase shareholder value. So that's an issue, because that could be at odds with your mission. I would say that anybody who thinks that that's actual factual, they should also read Google's IPO documents, because they brilliantly get around the fiduciary responsibility of always maximizing shareholder value. So it can be done, but it's difficult. You have to be Google. So the other one is you sell, and in most cases, most of the social enterprises or social entrepreneurs that we're looking at, and you guys, I mean, it's an exit scenario versus a merger or an acquisition, and you're mostly looking at getting acquired by a big local player, and that's problematic too, because then you're probably selling to the company that ignored your mission for a really long time. So why would they go back and do it? You as most social entrepreneurs, you're disruptive. That's your whole point. That's what you're in there to do. And so now you're going to go sell out to the company that was not being disruptive? Like, does that make a lot of sense? So that's a real big problem. I think Sid can talk about it from his perspective, what they did. I'd say from our perspective, we've been working on it a lot. So one of the things that we try to do is come up with self-liquidizing term sheets or self-liquidizing investment terms, which essentially is a way of saying we put the burden back onto you to get our money back. And so what that means in a lot of ways is we give the opportunity to entrepreneurs or companies to buy back our shares at a valuation based on market valuation based at that time. So let's say if after 5 years of holding the equity, you don't look at it and say, we want to get an exit, we want to go public, or we want to sell out to this other company, then you can just start to buy back our shares over a period of years at a fair market valuation done every year. The good thing about those kind of things is that we do the main thing that equity is supposed to do, which is ensure that the alignment of the company's interests and our interests are aligned. So the main thing is that to make sure that those are aligned, because when I'm trying to make your value greater in 5 years so that I get a higher liquidation amount, then we should be on the same page, because the value of your company in the cases that we invest is also the impact of your company in most cases. So that's something that, we're still working on. Are the terms perfect? No. Boards hate them. The next round of investors come in and they always try to cram us down and say, no, you can't keep those rights because then you might liquidate while I'm holding capital, and I don't want you to suck money out of the company. And there's a lot of hurdles. It's not a solved issue. But actually, let's say.
Yeah, I don't have too much to say on that. I think Miguel probably has the better perspective on this. But I think what you want to do is really focus on those terms up front when you take that investor. And as Miguel was saying, an investment is kind of a marriage. Really think of it as a marriage. I remember when we signed our papers, we said, there was 5 of us founders. We said, we're getting into a 5-way marriage. It really is. And same thing with the investor. Just understand up front what their metrics are for judging you and how and what's important to them, and then make sure that you're aligned with that. If you're not, don't take the money. I mean, it really is. It's going to cause problems down the road. And hopefully, if you have one investor, you will have a couple other investors lined up who, see the same value.
And to that point, in other words, that means also don't think of the exit. I mean, do think of the exit when you're there, and make sure that the exit that you're pitching to investors is something that you actually want to see. Yeah. Because if that investor comes on board and that's what's in their head, and they're thinking these guys are going to sell to this other big company in 5 years, and that's their strategy, and then in 3 years they realize, hey, that's not the strategy. They're going to be mad, and it's the worst thing. It's not that they can always overthrow you or they can exercise power. It's just that you can get miserable. I mean, you're having to deal with these people at least on a quarterly basis. A lot of times, more often, it's uncomfortable for everyone, and it's just not worth it. It's not worth It's not worth it. So you can find somebody better. If you got an idea that's worth it, you can always find somebody better.
Yeah.
There was a question here.
Real quick, what are you learning about valuation? Half of your valuation model in this space, and what are you learning about the importance of creating the capability to do near, intermediate, and long-term outcomes evaluation? So many social ventures, just like nonprofits and NGOs, have real challenges with valuation and outcomes measurement in the near, intermediate, and long-term. You need proxies. So as venture investors, as a social entrepreneur, what are you learning about the evolution of valuation models and the evolution of capability to even have intelligent discussions about evaluating outcomes on a near, intermediate, and long-term basis?
This is why we say the questions at the end. Oh, we're out of time now. Sorry. So on our side, I can tell you, so we've done everything. We got a student to write a thesis on something like this out of college. We got a group of MIT kids, Sloan kids, to look at this a while back and spend a semester kind of trying to figure out the proxy. Really, is what we were looking for, and for valuations. And there's not a great solution. So I will tell you my secrets to success. We actually have a pretty good portfolio at the time being, so I can say it's somewhat successful. We don't value based on what's going to be the valuation of the company at exit, because every line after the current year on projections is BS. So if I go and look at this and I can say I'm going to discount your cash flows and then compare the margins based on standards, industry standards, it's all BS after that. So
Very
it doesn't
true.
it doesn't really matter. Do we do that? Yes, absolutely. We do the discount models. We do look at standard margins across it based on your industry and that kind of stuff. But I guarantee I've never gone back after 2 or 3 years and looked back and said, "Hey, look at that. We were really accurate." Never. It doesn't happen. So what I can tell you is that if you hit X certain if we can map out milestones for the next 18 months. And you can hit those milestones if you can hit milestones in the next 12 months, that the next round of investors are going to pay more than I did. And that's how I start the valuation. Because as a seed stage investor, as the earliest investor, you and me, the entrepreneur and me, have one thing that we need to get done. We need to get the next round of investors in 18 months, 12 to 18 months. We need to get that next round of investors to recognize that the company is more valuable than it is today. That's about as far as we can go. Anything beyond that, and we're sort of grabbing for stars, and so there's no real point to it. Like I said, we still map out 5 years. You still want to make sure that there's a big market there. You still want to look at acquisitions or exit scenarios in that given space. But more importantly, we just want to make sure that in that next round we're going to have an up valuation. After that, then we're going to tackle that next 2-3 years, depending on the next round of funding. If the next round of funding comes in and it's going to give you a 24-month runway, we're going to look at those next 24 months and we're going to see what milestones do it need to be in place. What do we have to do in those next 24 months in order to make sure that C round that comes in does the same thing and that evaluation goes up. And to me, that's the best focus. It's something that aligns interests with the entrepreneur and with us perfectly. And it also, from the beginning, I can go and tell the entrepreneur it's really easy. From a valuation standpoint, that ugly conversation. A lot of investors in my stage don't invest equity; they invest convertible debt, which is sort of like equity, but it's as I call it. It's well, I won't say what I call it, but it's equity-like. The weird thing about convertible notes is it doesn't force you to have that uncomfortable conversation up front. I'm perfectly fine with uncomfortable conversations. I have no problems with conflict. I don't get uncomfortable in awkward situations. I'm perfectly fine with this stuff. That's part of my job, so I just do it all the time. But so I'm okay having that conversation. The other one is I think I have a great explanation for it. I can make a deal, and I will put a deal, where I'm going to get anti-dilution protection. So if we do this investment and the next round comes in and it's at a lower valuation than I'm offering you, you get totally screwed. You're going to lose so much of your company, it's ridiculous. And I'm not going to be touched at all. It's not going to hurt me. So when I say I'm going to give you this valuation today because in 18 months we're going to get a valuation that's 1 times or as equal or greater by a factor of whatever, I'm actually aligning our interests. Because if you do push for that higher valuation and it doesn't hit, then you're in a lot of trouble. So if you can prove it, and if you're willing to take that risk, and you're willing to go down that path, and you're willing to give me that anti-dilution protection, and you are so sure that you're going to get that valuation in the next round, it's going to be higher than what you're giving to me today, and you can convince me of it, great. We'll sign at that valuation, and you can have your pick. But in most cases, what we find is that I know the market pretty well on what the next round of investors are going to come in because I've got a portfolio of companies that have raised those next rounds, and I've seen how it happens. And so what we really focus on is hammer down milestones. I want to know, and the other thing is, like, for the next 12 months, you're just working. Like 12 months, your nose is down, you're hitting those milestones. All of this going off and trying to raise money, going to Davos because you got invited because it's real exciting and sexy and you're going to stand next to Tony Blair. Nah, you'll do that in 18 months. You're not doing it now. Right now, you're building that business. You're getting to sales because that's what matters. That's what your mission's supposed to be. Your mission is not to make you a great career, or your mission is to go out and get your product to as many people as possible. And so we're there to make sure that you focus on that for at least those next 12 months. After that, usually there's a lot more money coming in, and there's a little bit more room for error.
Yeah, I mean, 2 things that I think he has said really well. Milestones, set milestones. That's the key thing. If you guys all know who Desh Deshpande is, famous entrepreneur. He's built 2 public companies. One of the things that he told me once in a meeting, he's like, one of the things you need to do, set goals for your company. And if you don't, you're not going to hit every single goal. Well, hopefully you will. But if you don't, it's not about saying, "Oh shit, we're done." It's like, "Oh shit, why did that happen?" That's what you should be asking. So it's setting milestones, and then the other thing is, the investors have a better handle on this. Is comps. it's very hard to find comps in the social space because it's such a young space. But see if you can find some comps. For us, the comps were job websites that were focused on the formal economy, and you take a discount factor. But you should spend less time on finding comps and more time on establishing those milestones and figuring out how you're going to hit them.
We'll take one last question. Yeah.
We're fairly early stage in our idea, trying to decide between profit v non-profit, and what's the investor take on non-profits?
You have to talk to a different investor because we only invest in for-profits. No, I mean, look, honestly, I'm not one of these people who thinks that for-profits are going to save the world. For-profits got us into a lot of the mess that we're in the first place. So it's not like there's no perfect solution there. I think nonprofits do a lot of great things. And I actually just really, really recently read a great article about slamming this idea about for-profits, and I wish I could remember the guy who wrote it. But one of the things he said is, if you think that for-profits don't have scale, go talk to the Catholic Church. So, if you think nonprofits don't have scale, there's a lot of nonprofits that have scaled amazingly, have been around for a really long time, have done tremendous benefits. It's really more about the market that you're looking at. If there is a market, in other words, if there's a demand on there where you can have a market, you're going to do better, you're going to scale faster as a for-profit, not just because you're going to get investment capital, but because you're going to get revenue from your product that's going to allow you to internalize it. And the other one is, I can tell you this, there is nothing harder in this world. And your greatest challenge as a business is not raising money or coming up with a cool idea. Like a lot of entrepreneurs are like, no, I came up with this idea. Like, that's the hardest part. No, it's not. Trust me, that's easy. The hardest part is managing people. Hiring great people and motivating them over a long period of time to continuously do a task that in the end of the day is not very fun is a really tough job, okay? So when you run a business, you have to hire a lot of people, coordinate them, get them and get them out there to do something that you have to pay them to do, right? Because it's not fun. So as a nonprofit, you're going to sell the idea that this is great. Just take the hit from us now because of the mission. And you are constantly going to be selling to your own people. All right? As a for-profit, you're paying people and you're motivating them by payment. And if they don't perform, you fire them and you hire the next person. And if they don't perform, you do it all over again. And now some nonprofits work that way, but not most of them because you don't have the internal revenue structure in order to be able to pay people based on that. That becomes, I think, one of the biggest difference to the scaling of for-profit versus nonprofit is just that ability to actually properly motivate people so that they can grow your business. And you as the founder don't always have to be the charismatic salesman internally as well as externally.
So the only thing that I'll add to that is make that decision quickly and be clear about it. Do not hem and haw back and forth, and certainly do not go into investor meetings thinking, don't play the I'm going to do one pitch for this guy and a separate pitch for this guy and a third pitch for this guy. And, I have a for-profit model, non-profit model, for-profit model. Because what you'll do is you'll end up confusing your own internal team and your own because you'll be answering different questions. The models are fundamentally different as far as economics go. I think the scalability issues are kind of the same in the sense, how do you create a repeatable process that you can have ever decreasing costs as you scale. It's just a matter of how the economics work out. Can you extract some monetary value out of it? But make that decision very quickly and stick with it.
All right, I think we kind of exhausted Sid's time, but thank you guys for coming. I hope it was valuable, and thank you, Margaret.
Thank you very much.